moment, Salafism in the Muslim world, and we have asked Dr. Pal to present papers on the case studies in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And Dr. Pal will go first. Sultan Pal is an anthropologist specializing in transnational Islamic movements in the Middle East and more recently in Southeast Asia. His main research topics include social movement theory, the structure and function of transnational networks, religious authority, and sectarianism. Dr. Pal's current research in MEI focuses on Salafism in Lebanon and its networking in the Arabian Gulf and Europe. Before obtaining his doctorate at the University of Utrecht, he was visiting research fellow at the International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World and a research fellow at the University of Utrecht. He has published articles on Salafism in Kuwait and Lebanon, and he is the author of Lebanese Salafis Between the Gulf and Europe, Development, Fractionalization, and Transnational Network of Salafism in Lebanon, published in 2013. Professor Sayed Farid Al-Attas is a dear friend who is Associate Professor of Sociology at NUS. His areas of interest are historical sociology, the historical sociology of social science, the sociology of religion, and interreligious dialogue. Among his recent books are Alternative Discourse in Asian Social Science, Response to Eurocentrism, 2006, and two more recent books, Ibn Khaldun, published by Oxford University Press in their Makers of Islamic Civilization series, and Applying Ibn Khaldun, published by Routledge in 2014. So the first book on Ibn Khaldun is 2013, the second 2014, and he is currently working on the Ba Alawi Tariqa. So I'll ask Dr. Paul to start.
Thank you for the invitation. So, undisputedly, the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings in 2010 and 2011 has changed radically the socio-political landscape of the Middle East. And one of the most important changes was the rapid emergence of Salafism in the Arab countries. They suddenly became unavoidable factors of the political life of many Arab countries, and their presence also significantly expanded in the public sphere. And in certain cases, they formed powerful militant factions, as we can see it in Syria or currently in Iraq. But with this presentation, I have two main aims. First, I would like to investigate the reasons of this sudden expansion after the Arab uprisings. And the second part of the presentation, I would like to discuss how Salafism itself has been influenced by the changing context after the uprisings. So what kind of internal schisms, debates happened, occurred? And after I will demonstrate these developments with a case study of the recent transformation of Salafism in Kuwait. But before I start discussing these issues, I I would like to briefly summarize what do we understand under the term Salafism. But the terminology itself comes from as-Salaf as-Saleh, which in Arabic means the first three generations of Islam. And Salafis intend to adopt the belief and practices, religious practices of these first three generations. And one of their main distinguishing features is the literal interpretation of the scripture, of the Quran and the prophetic tradition. It means that they refuse any kind of logical or metaphorical reading. Salafis also intend to purify Islam from invention, or in Arabic bid'ah. Salafis believe that Islam today is corrupted, and Muslims has adopted a lot of foreign elements into their belief and their religious practices. So, like, for instance, seeking intercessions to God by deceased holy men, or even Salafis, they forbid listening to music. What they believe is a distraction from the Quran, and Muslims instead should recite or should listen to Quran recitation and not to music. Well, actually, Salafism is a quite old concept in Islam. It has emerged as a school of thought in the second century after the death of the Prophet. But as a modern movement, it emerged largely due to the patronage of the Saudi state. Actually, Saudi Arabia's ideological foundation is based on Salafism, and the Saudi government provided sponsorship to Salafis in order to proselytize abroad, and also it granted scholarships to students who wanted to study religious studies in the kingdom. And later these students, many of them were convinced by Salafism, and later they returned to their home and spread Salafism in their local communities. And despite its rigid or seemingly rigid ideology, Salafism is far from monolithic. We can distinguish at least two factions. The first faction is the faction of the purists, and the purists, they believe in the unconditional obedience to the ruler, until he is Muslim and doesn't become an apostate openly. Purists mostly focus on belief and religious practices, and very rarely, at least before the Arab uprisings, they very rarely engaged in parliamentary politics or institutional politics. There are some significant exceptions, for instance, Kuwait or Lebanon or Yemen. The other faction is the faction of the activists, or harakis in Arabic. Well, according to them, the ruler can be criticized and, if necessary, removed. They also believe in a wider range of activism on the socio-political field, including candidacy or to parliamentary positions or any kind of political participation. And also I classify the militant Salafis, the jihadis, as harakis who believe that only armed action can change the reality. But here I would like to emphasize that Salafism, despite that certain Salafis actually active politically, Salafism is not a political movement. Their main aim is purifying and transforming the identity of Muslims according to their understanding. So their number one aim is not capturing the state. So it's alike to the Muslim Brothers. After the uprisings and the fall of the regimes in Egypt or Libya, Tunis, etc., we could witness the wider institutional political involvement of Salafis. Salafi political parties were mushrooming. For instance, in Egypt, the most significant parties is the An-Nur party. In Yemen, the Salafis formed the Al-Rashad Union, and in Morocco, they participated were quite active in protest movements. Although in Morocco, of course, the regime didn't change. As I also mentioned, their presence in the public sphere rapidly expanded. Now, I would like to investigate the reason how was it possible? What was the main reason of this sudden prominence or emergence? So, I think the most important factor is the collapse of the authoritarian regimes in many Arab countries. Salafis previously, before the Arab Spring, they enjoyed a certain kind of patronage of the rulers, and some of them had an unspoken alliance with them. For instance, in Egypt, Yemen, Jordan, Kuwait, or Morocco, the authoritarian governments of the Arab states allowed Salafis to expand their social presence in the expanse of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was identified as much more dangerous to the ruling system. Salafis were able to establish vast networks of charity organizations, and also patronage networks. It meant that they provided material revenues for many disenfranchised young people. They provided them with the opportunity to raise to the middle class. The Salafis were also allowed to widen their presence in the religious scene, so they could establish, for instance, in Egypt, they could establish satellite channels which broadcasted religious programs. And also they were enabled to give a wide range of religious services, such as like religious lessons in the mosques. But Salafis were appealing to large segments of the society, in particular because they were able to project themselves as the imaginary Muslims. So it meant that they conducted a lifestyle, what could be identified with the term of Max Weber as mild asceticism, which meant that like it's different from the extreme form of asceticism. It means that Salafis they live a virtuous lifestyle. Instead of suppressing their desires, they try to control them, which in their case means a strict application of the Sharia. They, for instance, they follow a strict dressing code and ethics of behavior. Mostly they wear simple Islamic clothes. They use a distinctively Islamic vocabulary, which is they use certain idioms which are quite common in the Gulf, but in other Arab countries they are mostly associated with Salafism, like Hayyak Allah, which means God may grant you a long life, or Jazakallah khairan, which means may God reward you. Actually, this image of the Salafis was boosted by the decreasing legitimacy of the official religious authorities in several Arab countries, because actually the mainstream ulama were co-opted by the state. They became civil servants, and by the ordinary people they were associated with the regime, with the state institutions. Salafis, although they were patronized by the state and they had a kind of unspoken alliance, they mostly did not enter the state institutions. So at least ordinary believers did not associate them with the government. Here's one of my Salafi informants in Lebanon, and he's a good example of the appearance of Salafi activists. But after the uprisings, Salafis were able to utilize their social capital, which they collected or acquired before the revolutions, which enabled them to enter institutional politics and also to gain a more powerful appearance in the public sphere. It meant, for instance, that they made that point by often committing violent actions, for instance, burning liquor stores or burning such shops which sold pornographic material. Sometimes they insulted women who were not veiled. And also, Salafis applied a quite powerful sectarian discourse after the Arab Spring. I mean, their sectarian framing is the most elaborate among the Islamic movements, and of course, sectarianism, the Sunni and Shia antagonism flared up after, especially after the eruption of the Syrian civil war, which turned to a sectarian conflict. Now, I would like to discuss how Salafism was internally influenced by the uprisings, by the changing socio-political context after the Arab Spring. Well, of course, the most important was their entering into institutional politics. Previously, the majority of the Salafis were suspicious about parliamentary politics. They often forbade electoral participation and candidacy. The majority of the Salafis, they called forming, establishing, or entering a political party as hizbiyya, or partisanship, which in their vocabulary meant that the person who participates in a political party becomes loyal to the party itself, to the leadership of the party, and not to God. But after the changing reality, Salafis had to respond somehow, and Salafis justified their political engagement by the fact that the first demonstrations in 2011 were launched by secular forces, liberals, leftists, and they argue that they intend to defend Islam against the secularist forces, and also, of course, the Muslim Brothers, who they traditionally see as a deviant movement. This is the first one is a symbol and the electoral poster of the Egyptian Anwar Party, and the other one is a symbol of the Yemeni Al-Rashad Union. Another important aspect of the influence of the Arab Spring on Salafism is secession within the purist faction, I mean the loyalist faction. We can identify a reformist purist faction who revise their stance towards the ruler and argue that the unconditional obedience should be rethought. And of course, there are conservatives who argue that the Arab uprisings only led to chaos and destruction. So they continued believing in their original stance or ideology. Well, I would like to demonstrate these debates and secessions, or the dynamics and logic of these secessions, with a case study about Salafism in Kuwait. Kuwait is a relatively unique case in the Gulf, because it's a quite open society. It has an influential parliament, and there are a range of political and social movements from the liberals and leftists to the Islamists and Salafists. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the purist Salafi faction was the dominant in the Salafi community, while Harakis used to be rather marginalized. The purists enjoyed a certain degree of state patronage, just as elsewhere, to counterbalance the Muslim Brotherhood and the Haraki Salafis. And they, most of the purists were gathering around a charity organization, Jama'iyat Ihya Turaf al-Islami, which can be translated to English as Revival of Islamic Heritage Society. It became the umbrella organization of the purists, and also it has actually significant charity activity abroad. It's basically the biggest Salafi charity in the whole world. They built thousands of mosques and Islamic institutions, and mostly in the Middle East and Asia, and also they provide monthly salary to many Salafi preachers, thousands of Salafi preachers abroad. Actually, purist Salafis, as a quite unique case, even before the uprisings, they used to play a quite active political role. The Ihya Turaf political arm, the Salafi Islamic gathering, always formed quite strong parliamentary factions in the Kuwaiti National Assembly. Well, the Arab Spring actually did not lead to the collapse of the Kuwaiti regime, but significantly shook it. In 2011, in the summer of 2011, a series of demonstrations led to the fall of the government of Sheikh Nasser Mohammed. The demonstrators argued that actually the government is inefficient, corruption is widespread in Kuwait, and they demanded a more transparent political system, and also solution of the housing crisis and other issues. And the political turmoil in Kuwait has been continuing until today, which led to the emergence of a strong and diverse political opposition. Now, the purist Salafis of Ihya Turath also has been significantly affected by the spring and by the events in Kuwait. Initially, they were against the Arab revolutions. They issued fatwas against the demonstrations, but after the brutal crackdown on the protesters in Syria, Libya, and Egypt, some of them changed their minds. And a reformist and a conservative faction emerged within the organization. It's a picture of the demonstrations in 2011 in Kuwait. Well, this reformist faction is led by Sheikh Nazim al-Misbah, who is currently the president of Ihya Turath Fatwa Issuing Council. So he's Nazim al-Misbah. And even Nazim al-Misbah himself, in the beginning of 2011, issued quite fierce fatwa against the uprisings. But suddenly he also changed his position, and he started to argue that the question of the obedience to the ruler should be revised. It needs a more scrutinized interpretation. He tells that the ruler should be obeyed if he does not contradict the interest of the Muslims, and if he is not contributing to the corruption of Islam. But if the situation is in a certain locality, country is unbearable, then he should be criticized, and if he doesn't listen to critics, then should be removed. He also argued that the political involvement of Salafis should not be only to protect their da'wah or call proselytization, but it should be more. It should focus on more issues. He argues that currently society is too complex. One person, the ruler, can't manage it alone. So there's a necessity or a need of skilled individuals to participate in the decision making. And he tells that actually elections are an appropriate tool to send them, to place them into the political institutions. But probably the majority of Ihya Turath actually is following this faction, but nevertheless, the conservative faction is still quite strong. It's led by two sheikhs, Khalid Sultan, who is not identical to the politician, the prominent Salafi politician of Kuwait, and Ahmed al-Kus. They argued that actually the uprisings had negative consequences, and the protesters did not demand the application of the Sharia, but instead democracy, which is, according to them, is un-Islamic. It should be refused by Muslims. They argue that the Arab Spring is a Western conspiracy in order to destroy religion, and they even tend to reconcile with a radical purist stream, the Madkhalis, they call it Madkhalis. The name is coming from the name of Sheikh Rabi' Madkhali, who is a prominent Saudi scholar. And actually, Madkhalis, they used to be outside of all political or social organizations, institutions, because they argue that any kind of formal organization is it's not allowed in Islam, and they also argue that even like the criticism of the government or any issue related to the state is an open revolt against the ruler. Now this schism also had its impact on the political arm of the purist Salafis, the Salafi Islamic Gathering, a faction of this organizational movement. It's not a party because political parties are forbidden in Kuwait. Left and they joined the opposition, which I mentioned before. It's led by also a person named Khalid Sultan, but he's not the same person who leads the conservatives in Hayatullah. Like it was quite unprecedented before. They joined the opposition and joined the liberals, leftists, and the Muslim Brothers. Those who before they openly called the Trojan horses of the West. And they argued, they repelled the criticism of the conservatives that they do not disobey the ruler because protest is actually allowed under Kuwaiti law, so it's legitimized by the ruler. And also they criticize the government itself and not the ruler. So it's not a revolt. It's still allowed by the and within the credentials of framework of Salafism. I would like just to conclude my presentation in a few words. Well, I demonstrated or argued in this presentation that Salafism became an unavoidable actor in the Middle East, and it's a highly dynamic and fluid movement. And I think one of the main consequences of their prominence after the Arab uprisings is that they were able to reach wider masses, and of course these people are not going to become Salafis. Like, they are not going to follow in everything the rulings of Salafism, but their discourse, the ordinary religious discourse is increasingly influenced by Salafism as the ordinary Sunni Muslim thinking about Shias. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Middle East Institute for the opportunity to speak about this topic, which I think is very important because Singaporeans and Malaysians, we talk about our region, need to know more about Salafism and what I would refer to as this process of the Salafization of Sunni Islam. This is really what I'm concerned with. Now, by way of introduction, let me just say a few words. Since the 1980s, throughout the Muslim world, we have seen literature, writings, television programs, and other forms of discourse that function to inculcate prejudice among Sunnis with regard to Shiism, you have the demonization and vilification of Shiism, which usually, at least in the popular discourse and the polemical discourse, consists of a cocktail of half-truths, lies, misunderstandings, and some truths. In the case of Malaysia in particular, which is the country that I'm focusing on, you also have persecution of Shiites, which was stepped up in the last year or two. Of course, in other parts of the Muslim world, we've seen physical violence against Shiites in the Middle East, in Pakistan, in Indonesia even. There was an incident, I think 2 years ago, in which Shiites were actually killed and also evicted from their homes. The village was burnt. So this is briefly what is happening in the Muslim world. Now the intellectual backdrop of that is that there is this myth of the historical Sunni-Shiite conflict, and this myth is perpetuated in order to give the impression that prejudices and hatred are deep-seated among ordinary Sunnis and Shiites, and that these deep-seated hatred and prejudices are due to theological or religious differences. Now these myths are propagated by so-called Western experts on Islam, but they are also trafficked in by Muslim experts. There are several works that that speak of the Shiite crescent, the revival of Shiism, and so on and so forth. And they also perpetuate this idea that there is this historical divide, which is theological, it is deep-seated, and therefore the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites is inevitable. To make matters worse, the media insists on reporting in such a way that perpetuates these myths. For example, until today, the media tends to report on ISIS. When they report on ISIS, they refer to ISIS or the Islamic State as consisting of Sunni militants. And the reality of the matter is that they are not basically Sunni militants. They are Salafi. They are Salafis, and they are not accepted as Sunnis by the Sunni ulama. The problem is this myth is turned into a reality by contributing to the demonization and vilification of Shiites. So my claim in this is a larger project that I'm working on. My claim basically is that there is an attempt to Salafize Sunni Islam. This is manifested in the attitude towards Shiism that is mainly influenced by Salafis. Malaysia, for me, is a case study. We've seen in Malaysia, if you look at TV shows, we've seen Malaysia flooded by Saudi and Saudi-trained imams. Talks during month of Ramadan, especially last year, 2013. Salafi ulama in UMNO, in the Malaysian ruling party, and then of course the persecution of Shiites in Malaysia. These are all, to me, examples of the manifestations of Salafism. So what I would really like to talk about is, first of all, the myth of the historical Sunni-Shiite divide and the reality of the conflict with Malaysia as the case study. So let me just say a few words about this myth. I'd like to make a few points on that. First of all, there are, of course, real differences between Sunnis and Shiites, and the real differences have to do, to some extent, with jurisprudence, but more importantly with theological differences that arose in the context of disagreements over the political succession of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Nevertheless, the historical examples of conflict that we know about are are not to be exaggerated and are certainly not of the same type as that you have as what you have between, let's say, Catholics and Protestants. For example, you don't really have the equivalent of 30 years war in Europe between Catholics and Protestants. We don't really have parallels to that in the Muslim world. What you do have are mainly polemical wars confined to scholars, but even then, even the harshest critics of Shiism, and here I'm referring to 12er Shiism or to the Ja'fari school, even the harshest critics of Shiism, such as Ibn Taymiyyah, did not refer to Shiites as being out of the fold of Islam. Now, when there were serious conflicts and violence, these were generally politically motivated. In other words, the so-called struggle to defend Islam was a proxy for other interests. For example, when the Abbasids imprisoned Ja'far al-Sadiq, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, the sixth Shiite Imam, when they persecuted other Shiite Imams and descendants of the Ahlul Bayt or the Shiite Imams, when the Ottomans forbade marriage between Sunnis and Shiites, these were due to political motivations. When the Abbasids imprisoned Imam Ja'far Sadiq, they also imprisoned Abu Hanifa, one of the Sunni Imams. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, when there were moves against Shiites, such as forbidding intermarriages, this was due to the conflict that they had with the Safavids, and not due to theological reasons. Now, on this point, where we do have historical examples of conflicts, 2 points to be made. They were initiated by politicians and rulers, such as the examples I gave of the Abbasids and the Ottomans. And secondly, they were supported by ulama, by Sunni ulama, who were generally considered as extremists by Sunnis themselves. Examples being Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah. And they were not subscribed to in general by the majority of the common people. Another example I can give, in the 10th century in Baghdad, when the Hanbalis controlled Baghdad, you had anti-Shiite violence. And again, this is under the auspices of the Hanbali school of thought, or particular leaders within the Hanbali school of thought. Now, that the conflicts have been historically politically motivated cannot be denied. Since the Iranian Revolution, and especially after the formation of the first Shiite Arab state, Arab regimes have feared what they imagined to be the Shiite agenda. Shias, for their part, fought against Sunni regimes because of the different disenfranchisement and political, economic marginalization. Sunnis then reacted. Sometimes Sunnis reacted against reasonable Shiite demands, as had happened frequently in Saudi Arabia. Sometimes they were reacting against extremist Shiite actions, as happened under the rule of Nuri al-Maliki in Iraq. In doing so, they did not draw from mainstream Sunni scholarship when Sunnis moved against Shiites. They did not draw from mainstream Sunni scholarship, but generally from the Salafi orientation. The last point I want to make about the myth, regarding the myth of this Sunni-Shiite conflict, the myth of historic Sunni-Shiite conflict, is that you have centuries of tolerance, accommodation, living in the same neighborhood, intermarriages, attempts at dialogue. There are so many examples, and this was, generally speaking, the norm throughout Islamic history. Let me also point out that, see, nobody is denying that there have not been problems and conflicts that there's no history of discrimination of Sunnis against Shiites. But I think what is important to stress is that these were generally not supported by the leading Sunni ulama, even if they disagreed vehemently with Shiite theology or Shiite jurisprudence. So in the history of polemics between Sunnis and Shiites, you have serious disagreements on various issues relating to jurisprudence and more so in theology. And these disagreements are until today irreconcilable. But while having these serious disagreements, the mainstream Sunni ulama did not resort to pronouncing excommunication practicing excommunication on the Shiites. Furthermore, as I said earlier, those who were very harsh against the Shiites themselves were regarded as extremists among the Sunni ulama themselves. Now, some Sunni extremists and some Salafis would have us believe that the mainstream Sunni scholarship declares the Shia as heretics or outside of the fold of Islam. For example, it is said that Abu Hanifa referred to the Shia as disbelievers. It's also said that Imam Malik referred to the Shia as disbelievers. But this is contradicted by the fact that in the case of Abu Hanifa, he was a student of Imam Ja'far Sadiq, and it is also contradicted by the fact that in the case of Imam Shafi'i, he referred to himself as a Rafidi. He probably sarcastically accepted the designation because he is recorded as having said that if loving the Ahlul Bayt means being a Rafidi, then he would be among the biggest of Rafidis. And I think more importantly, when you look at some of the Sunni imams, particularly Abu Hanifa, he was subjected to the same persecution that Imam Ja'far was and other Shiite imams were. Now, if we are to accept the accounts of Sunni imams declaring the Shia as heretics or disbelievers, what then do we make of the accounts in which the Sunni imams themselves declare each other as heretics? For example, Imam Shafi'i is supposed to have referred to Abu Hanifa and those following Abu Hanifa as deviants. So clearly there are problems in these accounts. When Ibn Taymiyyah says that so-and-so said, that so-and-so said, that so-and-so said, that Abu Hanifa said that it's forbidden to pray behind, or that one of the Sunni imams said that it is forbidden to pray behind the Shiite imam. It's difficult for us to accept these statements because they have the status of weak or less than weak hadith. We can find many contradictory statements that are attributed to the various imams, so it is by no means clear that the so-called imams of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah had declared the Shiites to be apostates out of the fold of Islam. Now, regardless of what we may think of the past, regardless of what we may think of the nature of Sunni-Shiite conflict in the past, the point is, today, the movement against Shiites comes mainly from the Salafi camp and not from the Sunni camp. I think this has to be stressed, and particularly in the case that I'm looking at, Malaysia. If you look at the contemporary world, and I would like to now come closer to the Malaysian case, when we look at the contemporary world, there are many examples of Sunni-Shiite rapprochement. You have Shiites who supported the Khilafat movement in the early part of the 20th century. You have the establishment of the institution that is concerned with bringing the madhab together, Taqlid. Bain al-Madahib in Cairo. You have the famous fatwa of Sheikh Mahmoud Shaltut in 1959 that declared the Shiite as school, the Jafari school, as a legitimate school for Muslims to follow. In the Malay world, we have many examples of rapprochement and tolerance and understanding. In fact, in 1986, there was a fatwa issued by the National Fatwa Council in Malaysia that declared the four Sunni madhabs as well as the Ja'fari and Zaidi schools to be legitimate schools in Islam. This was in 1986. In Singapore itself, I think also in 1986, there was a fatwa issued by the Islamic Religious Council that declares that the Shiites are within the fold of Islam. This is stated very clearly in 1986. I think many Singaporeans have forgotten about this, and there continues to be, developing stream of anti-Shiism among Singapore Sunnis. But perhaps the most important, one of the most important pieces of evidence that reflect the Malaysian view towards Shiism comes from an event that took place in the I think 50s or 60s. One of the most well-known muftis that Malaysia has ever had, and maybe the only mufti who had an international reputation, Habib Alwi bin Tahir al-Haddad, mufti of Johor, had given or presented an ijazah for the transmission of hadith to Ayatollah Mar'ashi Najafi from Iran, senior Shiite cleric. Now, this is a very important piece of evidence because, there's no Sunni alim would give an ijazah to a cleric of a school that he considered to be deviant. So this is a very important event, I think, in the history of Islam in Malaysia. And often, of course, it's probably not known by the muftis, the current muftis in Malaysia, who, by the way, do not have any international reputation, whose rulings are not read internationally, and do not cannot be said, to be of the same stature with Alwi bin Tahir al-Haddad. In the modern world, there is no violence or killing of Shiites except due to the provocation for political or economic interest, and generally due to the support from Salafi ideas and groups directly or indirectly. So as I said earlier, whatever we make of the past, anti-Shiite views today are associated with Salafism, and what is happening today, the Sunni-Shiite conflict, in that sense can be seen as a turning point in Islamic history. Now, that being the background, what is happening in Malaysia? Now, I mentioned the fatwa of the National Fatwa Council in Malaysia in 1986, which declared the Shiites as a legitimate school of thought in Islam and legitimate to be followed in Malaysia. By the 1990s, I think it was in 1993, there were a series of fatwas from the National Fatwa Council as well as other states which revoked that ruling and which said that these schools, the Zaidi and Ja'fari school, are not recognized in Malaysia. And after that, there were a series of other fatwas which made it impossible, or which you could say criminalized, the preaching of Shiism in Malaysia. let me just sort of correct what I said just now. The fatwa which declared Shiism as acceptable was in 1984, not 1986. The Fatwa Committee of the National Council of Islamic Religious Affairs declared that the two Shiite schools, Ja'fari and Zaidi, were acceptable in Malaysia. In 1996, this decision was revoked, followed by a series of fatwas issued in multiple Malaysian states between 1998 and 2012 that placed restrictions on the spread and practice of Shiism. In the state of Selangor, Shiites have been arrested for performing their rituals. In December 2010, about 200 Shiites, some of them foreigners, were arrested by state religious authorities during a raid at a Shiite center. The Selangor Islamic Religious Department Director, Dato' Muhammad Khusrin Munawi, reportedly stated that Shiites are fanatics and a threat to national security. The idea was repeated on various occasions by Malaysia's state-dominated media. And this gentleman, Dato' Khusrin, is also reported to have said that for the Shiites, and this is it's amazing how people are ignorant and are unaware of the ignorance, and also unaware of the manner in which they are making fools of themselves. He said that for the Shia, the blood of the followers of other faiths is lawful, and it means that adherents of the followers of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah could be killed. He also made other incredibly erroneous statements about Shiism, such as Hajj is not compulsory for them, visiting Imam Hussein's shrine is sufficient for them to go to heaven. Now, if you look at the state of Perak, under Section 16 of the 1992 Perak Criminal or Sharia enactment, it is an offense to possess items relating to Shiism, including books, audio, visual equipment, and posters. In early August 2013, 2 Shiites were arrested, followed by another 6 arrests in September for possessing Shiite material. Mr. Ahmad Nizam Amiruddin, the Perak Islamic Religious Department Enforcement Chief, is reported to have said that the Shia should be eradicated. This was reported in English newspapers, that the Shia should be eradicated. In the Malay newspaper, I think it was the Utusan Melayu, I checked, the term used was menghapuskan, which means to eradicate. So here you have, not only persecution, but you have persecution in what you might call a theo-fascist mode, talking the language of eradication. In March 2014, again in Perak state religious authorities arrested more than 100 people believed to be Shiites. The arrests were carried out while they were commemorating the birth of Zainab, the daughter of Sayyidina Ali, the 4th Caliph of Islam, and the granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, what is interesting is that in some cases, like in the case of Selangor, the religious authorities are also against Salafism or Wahhabism. And there are some fatwas against Wahhabism as well. So what you have is religious authorities in the state of Selangor moving against Wahhabis as well as Shiites, perhaps not realizing that the anti-Shiite stance is borrowed from Salafism or from Wahhabism and not from mainstream views of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So how do we understand this contradiction? I understand this contradiction, or I would explain this contradiction by saying that there is the indirect influence, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect influence of Salafism on Sunni Islam among the Sunni ulama of Malaysia. You have a direct influence in the sense that you have Salafi ulama active in Malaysia. You have Salafi ulama who are active, for example, as state religious authorities in the state of Perlis, which is which officially follows the Salafi position. I believe in the state of Perlis, the Shafi'i school is not mentioned as the official school of the state. You also have Salafi ulama who have joined the ruling party UMNO since 2010. So you have a direct influence of Salafism on the Malaysian religious scene in that way. The indirect influence is that you have rulings, you have views, and you have rulings that are adopted by Sunni imam, Sunni ulama, Sunni muftis in the various states, which are in line with Salafism and that are contrary to the centuries-old tradition of Sunni Islam. But these have been adopted by some of the muftis, probably, most definitely, for reasons of political expediency, because of the political tide that intends or functions to show that the ruling party is championing the Malay cause. Championing the Malay cause means to champion the cause of Islam. Championing the cause of Islam means to champion the cause of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And if the intention is to show to the Malay population in Malaysia that the ruling party UMNO is more Islamic than the opposition party PAS, if they can show that the opposition party PAS is outside of mainstream Islam, for example, if they can show that PAS has got Shiite members, this is one way to out-Islamize PAS. And indeed, a lot of this started, a lot of the persecution of Shiites in Malaysia, including the enactment or the implementation of some of these fatwas, started with the accusation that some of the PAS elite were Shiites. So this is where the political motivation comes in. Of course, along with that, you have some Salafi religious leaders who take advantage of the political situation, take advantage of that atmosphere, so that they have an opportunity to propagate Salafi ideas. And we must also add the fact that the current regime in Malaysia is closer than previous regimes were to the Saudi royal family. We must also add to the fact that Malaysia has been the destination of tens of thousands of Iranians, students as well as Iranians working and living in Malaysia, and that has also played a role in terms of creating more awareness of the presence of Shiism. Although I have to admit that for their part, the Iranians in Malaysia have not played a proper role in terms of creating more awareness about what Shiism is all about. I would like to just conclude by saying that just as it is wrong to, I feel of course it is wrong to stereotype Shiism and to distinguish between mainstream Shiites on the one hand and extremist Shiites on the other, who have been responsible for marginalizing Sunnis and perpetrating acts of violence against Sunnis. Just as we need to make that distinction, we also need to make similar distinctions among Salafis. There are at least three factions among the Salafis. You have the so-called quietist Salafis who reject politics and find politics to be something of an innovation, a wrongful innovation. You have the more political, activist Salafis, some of whom were discussed by Dr. Pal just now. You also have the minority, who are the so-called takfiri, jihadi Salafis, who believe in in forceful imposition of their ideas and who engage in acts of violence against fellow Muslims as well as non-Muslims. Earlier on I had said that the media wrongfully refers to ISIS or the Islamic State as Sunni militants. Now, the Islamic State or ISIS had its origins in Al-Qaeda. It was formed by Abu Musab Zarqawi in the early days, in the early part of the century actually. Formed this group called Al-Tawheed wa Jihad. And then that metamorphosized into other organizations, and at one point it was known as the Islamic State, it was known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They followed definitely a Salafi ideology. Abu Musab Zarqawi himself made classic Salafi statement referring to non-Muslims and Shiites. I quote, "They are the insurmountable obstacle, the lurking snake, the crafty and malicious scorpion, the spying enemy, and the penetrating venom. We here are entering a battle on two levels. One, evident and open, is with an attacking enemy and patent infidelity," I think referring to the non-Muslims. "Another is a difficult, fierce battle with a crafty enemy who wears the garb of a friend, manifests agreement and calls for comradeship, but harbors ill will and twists up peaks and crests. The unhurried observer and inquiring onlooker will realize that Shiism is the looming danger and the true challenge." Zarqawi then goes on to say that Shiism has nothing in common with Islam. And in this kind of discourse, there's often, discussions about Shiism versus Islam, Shiism and Islam, because Shiites are not seen to be part of Islam. Now, some of the extremist views of the Salafis are shockingly inhumane. For example, Sheikh Abdurrahman ibn Abdul Aziz al-Sudais, Imam of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, reportedly encouraged Muslims to rejoice at the murder of Sheikh Muhammad Said Ramadan al-Bouti, notable Syrian scholar. The Sheikh was killed by a suicide bombing at the Imam Mosque in Damascus in March last year, and he was a vocal critic of Salafism. Now, the majority of Salafis are not violent and do not condone violence. To the majority of Muslims, the views of Salafis, even the non-violent Salafis, are objectionable. There's no doubt about that. The views of Salafism are inherently intolerant. They pronounce as innovations the views and the beliefs and practices of Muslims that have been among the Muslims for centuries. So, inherently, views of Salafis are intolerant. But the majority of Salafis, who in the eyes of Sunnis have intolerant views, are still, nevertheless, peaceful people who do not condone violence against others. But obviously, what is problematic is that the minority of the so-called takfiri, jihadi Salafis are the most vocal. They have the backing of a state with enormous resources at its disposal. We don't really know the extent to which, or the way in which Saudi Arabia supports or supported Al-Qaeda in the past, or supports the Islamic State presently. There is some speculation that they are not supported officially by the Saudi state, but they're rather supported by private businessmen in Saudi Arabia. But the point is that even the peaceful version of Salafism is, because of its inherent intolerance and is propagated throughout the world, prepares the ground for more violent Salafi groups, in the sense that the uprooting of Muslims from their tradition, for example, Sufi tradition, is a prerequisite for Muslims to join Salafi groups. If you look at the profile of people, including Muslims in Europe, a worrying problem that a great number of Muslims from the United States and from Europe, from Australia, are joining the Islamic State in Iraq. And you look at Muslims who have, from the Muslim world, such as Indonesia and other parts of the Muslim world, who have joined the Islamic State. If you look at that profile, many of them are have been uprooted from their tradition. They grew up in families that are not rooted in particular Islamic tradition. Now, to the extent that even peaceful Salafism promotes the uprooting of tradition because of its hostility towards the centuries long tradition of Islamic thought and practice, such as the Sufi tradition, to the extent that peaceful Salafism promotes uprooting from tradition, they do contribute to the rise of a more violent form of Salafism. And let me just mention one more point. In Saudi Arabia, for example, people are beheaded in public for crimes. Of course, this is done legally, but there is an inherent barbarism in that. And one wonders what impact that has on Salafis who may make that transition from a more peaceful orientation to a more violent orientation. I'm only mentioning this because I think various factions, various groups have responsibility. Not only the Saudis and the Qataris, the United States for supporting the Saudis, of course, countries like Iraq, after becoming a Shiite-led state, disenfranchised and marginalized Sunnis, the Malaysian state for not taking a strong stance against Salafism. So all these groups have responsibility, have to be blamed. But I think my final point is that Muslims, because of the way in which governments, at least in the case of Malaysia, the government has been rather reckless in the way they handle the whole anti-Shiite controversy. Because of the reckless manner in which it was handled, Muslims need to be more self-educated about what Islam is, about what the various factions are, about the history of sectarianism in Islam, so that they can make more informed decisions and not be influenced by their media, by their politicians, and by the bigoted religious leaders that seem to be in charge of religious affairs in Malaysia. Thank you.